Hello, I'm Karen Jenkins Johnson, principal of Jenkins Johnson Gallery in New York and San Francisco. Thank you for joining us. My team and I hope you're healthy, safe, and well. We welcome you to our 24th Conversations on Culture, a platform for discussions with artists, curators, and collectors on current art world topics. Today, Amari Gibson will be in conversation with three artists from our current New York exhibition, What's It All About? Patrick Alston, Carmen Neely, and Jason Stopa. We have a thought-provoking conversation with these artists whose abstract work is being created in the first part of the 21st century, a period of dramatic change and shifting global dynamics. It is my pleasure to introduce Amarie Gipson. She is a writer, critic, and DJ, born in Houston, Texas. Excuse me for just 1 second. Born in Houston, Texas. She has a BA in Liberal Studies and Sociology from the St. Edward's University in Austin. She is an alumnus of the Mellon Undergraduate Curatorial Fellowship and Damali Emerging Art Leader Program. Amarie has held positions at various institutions, including the Studio Museum in Harlem, Art Institute of Chicago, the Contemporary Austin, and Museum of Fine Arts Houston. She is a former director of Mud Magazine, editorial director of Mud Magazine. She is currently the arts and culture editor of Howardina Mag. There will be a Q&A at the end of the conversation, so please send us questions via the Q&A button. Also join in the chat during the conversation. Welcome, Amari, Patrick, Carmen, and Jason.
Thank you, Karen. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's having a good Friday so far. My name is Amarie Gipson. I'm a writer, critic, and editor based in Houston, Texas. I was born in Houston, and I just want to say thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here in conversation with such talented and really brilliant artists. We're gonna just have a really relaxing conversation. It's Friday, and we're here to talk about abstraction. And so I'm gonna introduce our artists briefly so we can have enough time to jump into the convo. First is Patrick Alston. He was born in the Bronx in 1991, studied art and psychology at Wabash College in Crawfordsville, Indiana, and he lives and works in New Haven, Connecticut, and New York City. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you.
Carmen Neely was born in 1987 in Charlotte, North Carolina. She has a BFA and an MFA from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte and Greensboro, respectively. And she recently moved into a new studio in Chicago, where she's currently based. So congrats, Carmen, on your new studio. Jason Stopa, who's with us today, 1983. He was born in New Brunswick, New Jersey. He's currently a professor at Pratt Institute, where he received his MFA. He has a BFA from Indiana University, Bloomington. His work was featured in Art Forum, Hyperallergic, and Artsy. He's also a really brilliant writer who's contributed to Art in America, Hyperallergic, and the Brooklyn Rail. He currently lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. So here we are. Welcome. My first question is a request for you all to each talk a little bit about your relationships to abstraction. We'll eventually discuss legacies of Black artists working in abstraction and who some of your influences are. But Jason, I was wondering if you could kick us off and give the people a little insight into your work.
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. I've been making abstract paintings for the past 12 years, and in my recent abstractions, I'm interested in stages, gates, fences, things that kind of prop up an architectural space where a painting can perform itself. Something I'm really particularly interested in is how abstraction can have performativity, how it can perform the kind of language that it's trying to kind of get at. So often in some of the works that are in the show that are at Jenkins Johnson right now, I'm looking a lot at utopian architecture. And a lot of utopian architecture, you know, there's this very, very long history, you know, going back earlier through the Renaissance, but we see a lot of curvilinear shape in a lot of utopian architecture. And oftentimes references to domes, to archways, to circles. So these kinds of forms pop up again and again in a lot of the kinds of motifs. But one way I think of how abstraction can stage itself is then it props itself up as a proposition, as a question about itself, a way of kind of less giving us an answer and perhaps more positing a question about the possibilities for abstraction, the possibilities for ideal space, or a space that might feel idyllic. And in some of these, this one in particular that we're looking at, I'm sometimes looking at architecture that goes alongside a historical moment. So there's the famous reflection pool there on the National Mall. And you know, that reflection pool is kind of overlooking where Martin Luther King Jr. gives his speech in '63. So this painting is called Reflection Pool 63, kind of referencing the reflection pool itself as a kind of site or container for experience. And that's exactly what an architecture is a site or container for an experience. And I often think of paintings as being an illusory container for an experience as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Are there other places that you can think of that have similar histories to that of like the reflection pool? Are there places on your mind like in the present?
Sure. Yeah, my references are, you know, they vary quite a bit. One of my favorite painters, mid-century, is a painter, Alma Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
And Thomas is kind of, you know, there's a futuristic kind of quality to some of the paintings that she was painting in the late 60s, early 70s. And she even titles some paintings after things like Mars and outer space and a number of other things. So one of the paintings in this show is actually called Ideal City. And Ideal City is a reference to a chapter in a famous utopian architecture book, but also is a reference to the house that Sun Ra and his orchestra lived in New York City. And I think of sound often in painting as well, like the kind of the atmosphere perhaps, or the sound or the quality, the temperature that might exist in a space. And so I thought, well, what could it be to make a painting about the space that Sun Ra lived in? What would that feel like as an idyllic space? And obviously, Sun Ra is very interested in a kind of utopian, futuristic, very, very forward-thinking idea of life, art, and experience. And is also, I see that kind of contribution as also a very avant-garde contribution. Mm-hmm. It's like leading a potential passageway for how music could keep evolving, how jazz could keep evolving mid-century. It's less interested in maybe a kind of more a nice or formal kind of approach. It's really trying to kind of break with a lot of convention. And so I'm also thinking of that too in some of my paintings. How do I break with maybe a convention that a previous geometric abstraction would have seen as okay and fine for its moment? How can I push that conversation forward?
Thank you for that. I want to circle back to a question about color when we hear from Patrick, but Carmen, your relationship to abstraction, your journey to abstraction.
I agreed with and find resonance with a lot of things that Jason shared, particularly the statement about the abstract image being a container, because I think about my works as being documents of lived experience. My process begins with thinking about language, so verbal language, shared thoughts, phrases, statements, And I write things down from conversations that I have with people. Sometimes they're things that I say in the moment. Sometimes they're things that other people say to me. They're phrases that feel particularly strange or impactful, surprising, uncomfortable. It's a range of what the I guess motivation for documenting is, but something that strikes me in a particular way that feels like I need to revisit it, or I have to come back to it, or it's going to stay with me for some time beyond the experience or encounter. And those are the kind of things that I come to the canvas referencing and trying to embody through gestural abstraction. And I think of this material and this medium as a tool for translation of something that's very specific for me that maybe cannot be communicated effectively through retelling, through writing or explaining, again, in conversation. So it's about sort of trying to embody the things that I don't have verbal language for through this other form of communication. So the piece, for example, that's up on the screen right now, If You Really Love Me, You'll Talk to Your therapist about me, is from a challenging conversation I had with a close friend. And there's something about the feeling of that space and that tension that I carried with me and knew I wanted to sort of document. And I think that I have always, from the time that I was studying art or painting in academia and undergrad and graduate school, have always been drawn to the language of gestural abstraction. But I think there was a disconnect for me, I guess, in thinking about, at that time, the availability of this language as a tool that's accessible to me, as a valid way to communicate my experience. And so some significant painters that I was exposed to a lot, like Cy Twombly, Joan Mitchell, who are obvious sort of connections and influences to me, are people who are not Black. And so I think that distance, it has taken me some time, even since I've been out of school, to become more engaged with or closer to some other examples of people who are using this kind of language, like Jason was giving the example of Alma Thomas, who is not using gesture, but is also thinking about like translating information through shapes and movement in paint. And someone that I feel a really strong kinship with now is Howardina Pindell, who particularly has a series of works where she's combining collaged photographs from postcards of places and cutting them and creating her memory or an envisioning of the space in between these images that she's piecing back together with her own language of paint and through color and mark making and this other material. And this idea of trying to sort of fill in the gaps of her memory and be able to communicate that through image making. And I think that's ultimately what I'm trying to do with gesture. It's a combination of all these sort of separate moments and actions that reference writing, that reference oftentimes something about text or language, but it can never fully concretely be sort of one thing. So that accessibility is something that I think about in terms of the language that I'm using and how potentially people can engage with or access the work.
Yeah, there's a real emotional resonance in your work. And I'm curious, when you talk about translation and the way that gesture enables you to process some of the conversations that you're having, you're sort of making an archive. And I'm curious, I wanted to ask you about growing up in the South and how you feel like your work may be helping you process like generational trauma or like conversations with friends and family? How do they feel about the work when you make it? Is part of it public to them?
Okay. Wow, that's a lot. Okay, that's a lot.
I know it's loaded. It's loaded, but I'm curious. Like, I'm like, I feel like a lot of Black women artists use their work as a way to make an archive and to sort of heal. And so you have a really like intimate way of moving through feelings. Like you told me once that some people might look at the paintings and see the gestures as like happy or frenetic. And when it's really something totally different, you know, oh, that part of the painting, I was feeling something that this person doesn't pick up. I'm wondering how you reconcile that.
I think that for me, so the particular relationship with the South and sort of potentially how that's influenced the way I think about making art and what things are most important to me. I think storytelling and that kind of sense of history also being tied to objects as archives or souvenirs from people's lives or experiences. And I think that I shared with you when we spoke before that I have grandmothers on both my paternal and maternal side who had series of objects in their homes that were really significantly relevant to their personal history. So my father's mother collected salt and pepper shakers through a large portion of her life and had this really extensive, I mean, I think there were maybe like 100 sets. Some of them were things that she chose, then other ones were things that people gifted to her because they knew she had this collection. And they sent them from other places they traveled. So these were things from all over the world, but they were also symbolic of her relationships with people and also markers of different time periods in her life and specific geographic spaces. So there's all this additional value and information embedded in this object that is significant because she chose it or it lived with her in her space. And it's kind of like that is communicated in the collection of all these things, even without her being present. They somehow represent her. And so I think that the collection of all of these gestures as individual moments of reflection sort of operate the same way in a sense of storytelling and sort of being a culmination of a lot of different things kind of resolving themselves in one space. In terms of the specific narratives and potentially how people feel about them, that actually is different based on the different type of story that I'm referencing and the relationship that I have with that person. And I think I've largely been able to operate in this space where a lot of times the title and some vague visual references allude to things that are specific that I know and understand, and that person who was there knows and understands really directly. But there's enough kind of space in between that could be read as, I think of it as like this like flexible space. Not necessarily, I wouldn't use the word ambiguous because they're specific to me and that person in that moment, but because they're a little more open-ended and through this other language, there is a little bit of, I guess, distance that's created from somebody being able to understand like the full detail that may be information that somebody doesn't feel comfortable with other people knowing, or the specifics of something that feels really personal and potentially vulnerable or dangerous to that other person. And I try to be, even with the phrases, thoughtful about that kind of exposure because there are people connected to these images outside of me too.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I know that was like a big question. But that was super helpful. Patrick, your relationship to abstraction.
Yeah, I love what you two have said regarding language and sort of opening up a portal of trying to get across a sense of messaging. So my work, what you'll see on the screen, a long way from Zion, in this more recent body of work, I've sort of began to incorporate found materials. So I've sort of moved away from only using this sort of standard acrylic and oil approach to painting, and wanted to try to take things from my direct environment and begin to sort of tell narrative stories around my paintings. So I've been really interested in language and being able to translate sort of my direct environment and my upbringing in New York, and specifically in South Bronx, sort of into these abstract paintings and into these gestures and forms. So when I first began sort of playing with gestural abstraction, I was trying to find a way to sort of bridge the gap between these two different worlds that I found myself coming from. The sort of the academic portion of being in school and learning about the sort of ABEX movement and being influenced by artists like Philip Gustin and, like you said, Cy Twombly, but not necessarily being able to draw a connection to my direct experience. So I wanted to sort of bridge that gap. And what I found was that there were a lot of gestures that I saw within my direct environment that sort of held some of the same impact that I saw from these artists. So let's say graffiti murals, or just the unkempt nature of New York City walls. And I wanted to pull from those two, different environments and bridge the gap between the two using my artwork. The image that you see now is sort of 3 books that I recommend people to read or take a look at if they want to understand where my influence comes from. And the interesting thing is that a lot of my aesthetic influence is not necessarily from the artists that you see here, but it's their approach to painting. Specifically, Philip Gustin, he and the other two, I feel, understand the sort of spiritual approach to painting. So Philip Gustin speaks about the third hand and the ability of the third hand to sort of take over your process of painting. So the way he describes it is, you're in a studio with sort of, art critics, your friends, writers, everyone, and one by one they leave. And in the end, you're in the studio alone, and hopefully then you leave out of the studio as well, and you let that sort of third hand continue painting. So I've primarily really been focused on recently sort of tapping into that energy and tapping into the third hand he's speaking about, as well as what you see now is sort of color theory and color relationship. So the artist that you see below my work is Stanley Whitney, and I drew a lot of inspiration from his usage of color and the sort of healing qualities of color. And the way that you see this sort of grid setup, it's a work in progress in the studio, it's the wall behind me here, is that I, like Carmen was speaking about, wanted to begin looking at Black artists who are working in this this language. And for me, when I found an artist like Stanley, his work resonated with me because his subject is color, and that was such a liberating sort of idea and ideology for me that this man, this Black man, sort of took something as simple as color and made it a subject in order to tell his story and narratives on his end, to speak about the Black experience. So that's sort of a conglomerate of what I'm interested in and what the work is about. And
Yeah, Patrick, I wanted to ask you, where do you think music sort of fits into your relationship with abstraction, especially having grown up in New York and moving through the city? Graffiti, as you mentioned, right? Like the start of hip hop, a deep jazz legacy there. And this is a question that I could open up to the 3 of you, but I'm really curious. I feel like we've been remiss to not talk about music.
Yeah, music is, I always have music on in the studio, and it helps me to sort of tap into that subconscious state, so that I'm able to direct that energy that's coming from the music onto these paintings. So I like to, before I even get into the studio and work, I'll walk around the neighborhood and sort of taking the visuals from the outside, or I'll pick up materials that I come across I don't know if you can pull up the slide, a few stars, a lot of stripes. I saw, that one. I saw this flag in the South Bronx. It's a portion of the American flag, and I was actually listening to "Murder to Excellence" from Jay-Z and Kanye West when I saw that flag, and there was just this profound moment for me, when I was looking at the symbology of this flag and what it sort of stood for. So I titled this piece "A Few Stars, a Lot of Stripes," and it was critiquing the idea of the American dream and sort of who has access to the American dream. But I don't, if that song weren't necessarily playing in that moment, I don't know if the sort of flag would have resonated the same. So it's something that informs my practice in that way, where I take messages that's in the music, but also just the sort of rhythm and flows of jazz music and hip hop that I try to recontextualize into these paintings.
Carmen, Jason, any thoughts on music in your practice? No pressure.
Jason, do you want to?
just passing the buck, huh, Carmen? I'll try it. I think music is important. I don't believe that there's like I don't think that there's like a direct correlation necessarily between what I'm trying to listen to and what I'm trying to paint. It's not that linear for me. When I'm in the studio, I actually tend to listen to some very kind of minimal drone and ambient music, stuff that's like, it's almost so much in the background that it's like, it's barely there, but it's just kind of enough there. I'm really actually trying to actually get away from, this is unique maybe to my practice. I actually feel like I'm actually trying to leave so much of my everyday life and concerns at the door of the studio so that I can actually tap into this other thing that has to happen. And there's often a transition for me that has to happen between paying bills and grocery shopping and so on and so forth, and then actually trying to focus on this thing that I'm trying to make and how I want it to feel and how I want it to look. And music kind of facilitates that. I think it helps like redirect wherever my kind of mental energy is. But it's not maybe a translation of trying to kind of use that sound to make the work. I feel like the work is actually trying to come from somewhere else.
Right. It doesn't have like an active presence in the work, the making of the work.
Yeah, like maybe more of a background kind of presence in it.
Yeah. Carmen, did you have something?
I think I definitely use music to try to tap into a particular kind of mood or energy to help facilitate. It's interesting. I think our relationships all totally reflect the style in which we like compose images to. And I think that if I'm trying to directly embody something, it's important that I make the painting really close to the time I experienced this like conversation or event, and that I'm really intentionally and actively trying to stay engaged with the feelings around it. So, I mean, it sounds really like simple and direct, but if I am making work about being heartbroken, I am also trying to like stay in that sad space, and like I'm listening to sad songs and being sad in the studio. So
right, put on Keisha
that's
Cole,
just what happens.
Try it out. Cool. I'm curious, Carmen, while we're on you, if you wanted to talk about the text piece in the show that accompanies the paintings, the wall drawing.
Sure. So the text, this exhibition is the first time that I have handwritten on the wall journal entry that was that manifested itself around the same times the paintings were made. So there are two different forms of documentation that feel like they're absolutely from the same narrative, from the same time in my life. So in that way, they're completely connected. And it felt really significant and necessary to write directly on the wall in the space, the text. And I did it with graphite pencil, which is the same tool I use when I am writing into the painting. If there are any sort of like direct references to language or legible words included. And I think that they are in conversation with each other visually in the space, because it's all right coming from not just the same memories or same time period, but it's also a connection between the gestures and the movements in paint and sort of the movements that happen in handwriting. So it's meant to be something that adds more context for the abstract images, but in a way, to me, still feels it's more concrete, obviously, because it's recognizable English that can be read and interpreted in a different way, but still feels abstract to me. So it's important in my process of working to be really honest all the time and just kind of lay everything out on the table. But I'm also trying to do it in a way that is somewhat like malleable and still accessible to other people. So I don't want to describe the text as poetry. I'm describing them as journal entries because I feel like poetry comes with its own other like set of, I don't know, like burdens and things around it. But so they're journal entries. Oh yeah, so that's an image of the text next to the piece on the wall. Yeah, so I think I answered. I think I answered.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. In terms of process, you said that the work always starts with the title. In terms of writing, are you journaling and then looking back through and reflecting on the things that you've like processed on your own and then pulling from the journal to then find the titles of your works?
They're really separate processes.
Okay.
And so the impulse to write that way with text is not the same impulse to paint, and I have to work through those things in a totally different kind of headspace and approach. I mean, it's like speaking two different languages. I think it's kind of like there are words that exist in Spanish or phrases that we don't have language for in English, right? And so it's kind of, I think of it in that way, is that they're expressing similar sentiments. They're about kind of the same, however, month period in my life where I was dealing with a particular set of things, but it's not articulated in the same way.
Right. Jason, similarly, what's the role of writing in your practice? We spoke a bit about this one-on-one, but for the people.
Yeah, I do a fair amount of writing and about others' works and reviews, and I have a sketchbook, and sometimes I'll journal in my sketchbook. It's intermittent, but I often find it a lot harder to write about my own work than it is to write about someone else's. And in a way, writing about someone else's work for a magazine is a way of like clarifying the things that I value in painting. In particular, I tend to write about painting more than I write about many other mediums. And then it kind of, I get to tell myself why. I get to tell myself why it is I value that thing by explaining myself in the review. And it comes up with like a justification that's beyond maybe just my own personal tastes or preferences, and it helps inform then the decisions that I do or do not want to make in my own painting, because it feels in a way like research. In many ways it is. I have to read up on that artist, read up on past reviews, things that they think about in interviews, and then form my own perceptions about what it is they're trying to do and what I actually think about it. So I see it as like a way of having a dialogue, especially in a moment in which artists are all over the place now and don't really gather in a centralized location or neighborhood as much as maybe they once did in New York in decades past. So I see it as a way of kind of like trying to engage in my own way through writing.
I'm staring at the paintings in the background in Patrick's studio. And Jason, I wanted to ask you about your use of color. I feel like it's such an attractive part of your work. It's a really exciting part about your work, and it's been consistent as you've moved from, focusing on geometry to more specifically architecture. If I got that right, I want you to talk about color.
Sure. I think color is really specific. Like color is not an arbitrary thing. And so when we're using color, I harp on my students about this, and I think they hate me for it, but I always say that like color is actually something that like there's a palette for everything now. So like if you're using a certain palette, it probably has a historical reference point for that palette that was used for specific purposes. And there's no kind of palette that's like somehow entirely neutral or without reference at this point, which I think is an interesting problem, actually like a really difficult and complicated, fun abstract painting problem to try to tackle. I'm particularly always thinking of two different kinds of palettes. I'm often thinking of like pre-Renaissance palettes, the palette of like Piero and Giotto. In particular, this is like a reference to the Scrovini chapel in Padua in Italy. And that chapel in particular, there's like this really kind of specific, gorgeous blue and yellow that Giotto is using in that chapel. And there it's like this reference to like this metaphysical religious sense of color, this like holy divine sense of the potential for humans to be caught between their physical and immaterial aspirations. And then I think of like color in like early part of the 20th century, France and America, which is kind of similar, but like in a very hedonistic way. When you look at the palette of like Cézanne and Matisse and many other painters, early part of the 20th century, there's this like exuberant, vivid, bright, graphic sense of color in a lot of paintings. And there it's like often in service of like The Bathers or The Joy of Life by Matisse, all these paintings that are kind of about like drinking and having sex and enjoying like nature, like this like escape to paradise, this escape to like some sort of Eden-like moment. And I see those as like two ways of thinking actually about the same kind of problem. Like one is like divorce yourself from the body and be this kind of religious higher self that's trying to aspire to this divinity. And this other that's kind of like the way to escape the problems of the world is by going toward like a kind of sensual pleasure and paradise. Forget your everyday kind of life.
Right.
And I see those as like two palettes, two ways of thinking about a similar problem. And I'm often trying to kind of find my own intersection between those palettes. So there's like color that I'm using that's often graphic and punchy up against color that's maybe a little bit more saturated or somber, and trying to kind of find a middle ground in those palettes. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm thinking of color.
Thank you for that. I want to ask a question about largely about Black artists working in abstraction in 2021, and what you say to people who don't understand the work or don't feel connected to the work or think it's not legible. How do you usually respond, or how do you deal with the expectation that the work is supposed to be representative and reactive? Yeah. Patrick, do you want to start?
Sorry, I was muted. I think that's a very difficult conversation and one I've been trying to tackle for a while. And what I've noticed is artists who influence me, someone like Raymond Saunders, who I find to be, such a brilliant artist today. I think it's a bit troublesome to see that he's not recognized, and I think it's because he is not working within, let's say, a literal sort of figurative form. And I think that it's sort of, for me, I challenge viewers still to, look at these artists and to try to take the time to see how their experiences connects to the works that they are making. But I think the conversation is sort of moving forward. I think we see a lot more interest in the works of Black abstractionists.
Yeah.
There's the New York Times article that was speaking about artists finally getting their just dues, which referenced Alma Thompson. And I think it's just a conversation that we'll have to continue to push forward and to sort of show why it's important to consider these artists within the lexicon of Black art making and aesthetics. But I try to have the conversation all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel pressure? Do any of y'all ever feel pressure to switch up?
No, I think, what it is? I think that I sort of, after being an undergrad and learning about the people of the Abex movement, and then sort of having to go through my own studies to find, the Jack Whittens and Stanley Whitneys of the world, it fueled a fire underneath me to continue that legacy and to continue to push that the conversation forward. So there's a pressure in terms of sort of wanting these artists to get their just due and to sort of, change the well, not change the conversation, but to add on to the conversation that's taking place now.
And keep moving it forward.
Keep moving it forward, yeah.
Carmen?
I think we're at a moment where conversations are expanding around particularly Blackness and identity in painting and image making. I think so. Something that felt really important to me was the Magnetic Fields exhibition that I think was in a few spaces a few years ago that had women of color who were abstract painters, many that I was hearing about for the first time in that show, and thinking about exhibitions, even like this one, where we're grouping people together and thinking about identity being expressed, experience being expressed in these different ways. Something that I think people are also challenged by is the fact that a lot of contemporary abstraction is very conceptual and requires time and space invested in looking and thinking and asking questions. And we were all sort of forced to slow down in this particular way with COVID intervening in our lives, which I'm thinking maybe is also forcing people to maybe approach art differently or think about approaching it differently. But generally, I think looking at figuration has been, it's like you can read it more quickly. And not that it's all, not to reduce it all to being like quick and easy, but can be a different type of looking and engagement. And so I think also that hurdle is something that we're all challenged with in making these types of images now, particularly with like Instagram scrolling and all the stuff of how people are largely seeing a lot of work too in this moment. But I still feel like there's so much more information available now, and that there seems to be a larger collective conversation about all the gaps that need to be filled in history, where people have been omitted, not that they weren't present and making, but that they've been left out of conversations. So I feel hopeful in that way, and not at all sort of pressured to force figures where they don't belong.
Because it takes a lot to be vulnerable enough to pour yourself into a composition, no matter what the circumstances. So yeah, there's somewhat of a disconnect between how much it takes to make an abstract painting and what people think it takes to make one. Jason, I was curious about your thoughts. I know you're an advocate for nuance.
I sure am. Yeah, I think it's really important to have a certain amount of mystery and sometimes complexity that actually adds something to painting or to visual art, I think in general. Um, I think I remember we mentioned this when we talked originally, is sometimes when I think we're using the term accessibility, sometimes I think what people are trying to actually say is, I just want to get it.
Yeah.
I just want to know this thing without having any mystery or thing that I have to understand or figure out. And I don't know if that's necessarily a positive. I don't know if that's a virtue to want to just be able to get something in its entirety. I don't know what that actually even looks like. I don't know what I personally have in my life that I feel like I know in its entirety and don't have questions about.
Right.
Those questions are like formative and important, and I think make life really rich and exciting to have things that you question and grapple with. I think of like the Julie Moretu show that's up at the Whitney right now.
Yes.
It was interesting in that, you know, I like some of Julie's paintings quite a bit. I questioned when I was in there some of the language that was used around some of the paintings. I thought, I don't really know if I think some of these paintings are about globalization or post-colonialism or a number of other things. Sometimes I thought maybe they were about some of those social issues or political issues, and then other times I had questions about it. And I liked that. I liked that I had questions as opposed to like, oh yes, I walked in here, the press release said it was about X, Y, and Z, and my takeaway was X, Y, and Z. I don't want that nice little bow wrapped up in it. And I think I want to invite audiences in all kinds of parts of the arts to also kind of allow some space for there to be some unresolved feelings and thoughts about things that you can talk about and keep talking about after you've left that exhibition, and that can be really interesting.
Thank you for that. I want to be mindful of time and quickly look through our questions really quick. Before we get into audience questions, I wanted to know if there were things across the three of y'all's work that you were curious about and maybe wanted to ask each other.
Patrick, I am so happy that I got to see your work in person at the opening, because I have followed you for a while and seen everything online. But it's a really different experience because there's so much material range in one painting that I couldn't fully read just from looking at pictures. And also something that I'm really interested in engaging with when I'm in front of the work is the way that you are addressing things behind the surface. So they're not just different textures or different material engagements within sort of the structure, but also contained maybe potentially within the painting and also attached on top. And so I'm just curious to know what you're thinking through when you're making those decisions about sort of where to place materials behind, on the surface, or on top of, and what those kind of spaces mean to you and the meaning of the work.
Yeah, I guess I've named those areas that you're referring to, where there's like the silk sort of windows are what I call them. And for me, there's sort of a way to open up a new space to begin to use materials that hold their own weight in conversation and meaning, so that I can introduce those into the works and begin a conversation about that thing in particular in relationship to my thought process and the overall aesthetic of the work. So you can probably see that window here. I am not necessarily, when I first make the window, I don't necessarily know exactly what's going to go behind it or in front, or if I'll, incorporate anything into it at all. I have to live sort of my day and come across materials and sort of see what speaks to me, as I was referring to earlier, that may fit into, what I'm thinking about for that moment. So yeah, those are fairly new. And I think that it's really tough because I've tried, many ways to take images of the works, and it doesn't seem to encapsulate all of the, surface tensions that are going on. But yeah, I think that I became a bit frustrated with just trying to use paint, like I mentioned before, and just use, such a sort of, everything was too flat for me. I needed there to be more almost sculptural space, three-dimensional space, so that an audience can sort of move around the work, and the shadows that are created now and sort of draping things adds another layer of mark making that I can't get with, standard cotton duct, canvas, and, stretching that around, stretcher bars. Now I'm utilizing these transparent materials and vinyls that sort of, even the vinyl that you see on the bottom of this painting here, there's not a paint that's sort of luminescent enough to make that that color. So it's just another way for me to expand the language that I'm working in. But yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
That's a good question, Carmen.
Do you ever make a freestanding painting, Patrick? Like one
No,
that...
I'm not really happy with the backs of the paintings and how they look. I've thought about it, but
Gonna throw in some questions.
I have found, Jason, when you mentioned your usage of color, I found that really interesting. And early 20th century paintings sort of stick out to me, and my usage of, some of the colors. And you mentioned a few, but Matisse's Red Studio is a painting that sort of haunts me because it's such a beautiful red that's used there. And yeah,
Whitney and Stanley Whitney is so hugely inspired by Matisse.
Yep.
So
yeah.
There's a question in the chat that is about color and one about medium. While we're on the topic of color, is there anything that you try to stay away from? Is there a certain color that you're pulled to and have a connection with? If not, how do you, the other question is, how do you explore new mediums? Do you have plans to take abstraction to new materiality? Does it happen often? We can combine those.
To be completely frank, although I use the color, I hate painting with red. Red's such a tough color for me to understand. The range of red, it quickly goes into, a salmony pink, or if you go the other way, it could muddy into a brown. But I think that I'm sort of, my strong suits are yellows and blues, and but red, I would say, it's a tough color for me to use. And I mean, because my paintings are so sort of monochromatic now, and I'm separating each individual painting, by a specific palette, I've just found it really tough to, there's a few colors that are tough to use, but red stands out, green as well, but yeah.
Do you not feel like in some way though, you have this urge to want to be able to conquer that relationship?
No, not really, to be honest. It just gets frustrating, and because I'm making these grids now, it's a color that I want to incorporate because it holds such strong elements and weight to it. I'll probably have to compromise and introduce the salmons and browns into the painting, but it's all right.
It's funny, I have a similar thing with the color purple, that it just never really comes out in a way that I'm comfortable with. So I use it very minimally. And thinking about material expansion though, that's something that's on my mind a lot right now because of the writing that's becoming more prominent in my work. And I'm using audio recording of my own voice and other people's voices at the moment. I'm working on this project, which is really new and still in development, but thinking about sound as a material, and also the communication of these texts and my feelings at the time of writing them, sort of not translated through different voices, but there's something about hearing these statements read over and over and over again, the same words, but through different intonation and like projection level and accents that completely makes them new and fresh every time. And so I've been really interested in this project that I'm working on now is a repetition of the text through all these voices back to back to back. And what happens when in that space is that the words become really kind of abstract in this way, in a way that feels directly related to what happens with the paintings. So that's something I'm thinking about currently.
Before we go on, I want to invite Karen back to join us for the Q&A.
Hi, what an interesting conversation. Thank you. Amari, was there something that you wanted to ask in that's something that's in the Q&A before I ask a question?
Yeah, Jason or Patrick, I wondered if you wanted to weigh in on exploring new mediums.
I'm actually beginning to delve into installation. In my last solo show in New York, I had a piece titled Red Sea, which was biblically inspired and inspired by the doings of Robert Moses, who was the person who introduced the Cross Bronx Expressway. And I was just interested in these two different Moses figures and the way that they sort of navigated communities, you know, in one way or another. But I've introduced that. I think I'm going to expand on it. But yeah, I'm sort of happy with the materials I'm using now. I'm always exploring and experimenting, but it's tough not to use cotton duck canvas because now I have to experiment in the durability of some of the materials and holding paints and the archival nature of some of the materials. So.
Yeah, I experimented a little bit with installation as well. I can totally relate to some of those same feelings. And you know, that's been something that I go back and forth with between making paintings and then paintings that exist within an installation format, and something I still consider with some of my solo shows.
Karen, did you want to introduce?
Yeah, well, yeah, I have a question, but I, you know, Jack Whitten talks about, he had a ritual that he did every morning when he came into his studio. He had his memorial wall where he had family members and he had objects there of the family members, and he would light a candle and he'd ring a bell, and so that would bring their spirits and memorializing them into his studio, even though, you know, it was something that he did, and it helped him ground himself in the studio. Is there a structure or ritual that you guys practice daily or weekly with your process?
That's a good question.
Carmen. Anyone, y'all? Anyone? Patrick?
Carmen, do you have rituals?
I think Patrick needs to unmute. I think he's trying to say something.
I'm thinking, I feel like we all must have these like practices that maybe we're not even conscious of, that
mine is pretty, I mean, I don't really view it as a ritual, Karen, but I usually make a mess in the studio. So I love to leave the studio in that state so that the next time I'm in the studio, I have to begin cleaning, and it gets me moving and it gets me to sort of reorganize so that I can get a sort of fresh start in the studio. And in that time where I was speaking about this sort of conscious / unconscious, I'm tapping out and I'm sort of beginning to be engraved into just being here in the now. And I just sort of, I find that very helpful. It's just something that I do. I don't know if I sort of planned it that way, but it's become a sort of routine to intentionally leave the studio in a state to where I have to sort of come in and tap out to tap in.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything that I'm consciously aware of as a ritual, but yeah, so similar. I after I've made a body of work and I no longer have any space to paint and the place is a mess, I then have to like clean and reorganize, and that does seem to kind of switch something up. It kind of like creates some new space. I'm also somebody who draws all the time, and I think that's like maybe the one through line for me is that, you know, I just have like sketchbook after sketchbook after sketchbook that's just filled up. And when I'm like totally lost and have no place to go, it's like, oh, I know I can just kind of enter into this space without any hesitation or fear that it has to be anything, even a successful drawing. It can just be me kind of messing around. So that has always been a space that feels like I can access.
Cool. Carmen, you don't have to answer, but listen, so, you know, let's just get cut to, there's an elephant in the room here, Carmen and Patrick and Jason, that I just want to bring up. How is it being a young, you know, abstract Black painter in America in 2021? And what are you doing to, how are you handling that? And how are you trying to promote forward this abstraction to our friends and families and collectors that are focused on representation? How are we trying to, how are we trying to take down those barriers? Or are you, or what are you doing to expand this conversation of people are stuck in this representation rut to include abstraction?
Well, I think with all of us, I think it's just continuing the practice and to continue to sort of participate in conversations like this and exhibitions like this. And we mentioned before sort of the heavy representation of figuration within Black art right now. And I wanted to say this before, but what I find is that sort of when you're creating art like that, you can sort of see the Black body and, you know, incorporated into the work, so it's a lot more accessible. And I've always sort of viewed my work trying to bridge the gap between my upbringing and the aesthetics of Western abstraction as the bridge or the gateway, so that people can sort of, you know, aesthetically maybe see themselves in the work. But I don't know, it's tough to say. I think that people are becoming more aware of the need for conversations around Black abstraction. And I'm not sure if I would say I found it tough or not. I think it's pretty tough being an artist in general. But I think it's tougher when there's a lot of explaining to do when it comes to the work, because I also find it such a disservice to try to explain what the work is about, because you sort of, you leave more out than what's actually in the work. And I don't, when I speak about my work, I don't want to necessarily be so literal in the way that I'm approaching the work. So when I spoke about finding materials or listening to music, it's not necessarily that I'm, you know, taking that material and, you know, being so literal with what the meaning of that is. You know, I like that those materials hold their own meanings and relationships to people when they approach them. So, you know, using pleather materials or silks or the vinyl, everyone's going to have their own experience when they approach a painting and see it and sort of wander through it. You'll be able to bring forth your own experience.
Well, I wanted to add, especially because Alma Thomas's name was mentioned earlier, and she's someone who when I've read statements that she's made in interviews or things that have come up in her talking about her work, there are some things that I really resonate with that might sound contradictory to, I guess, somebody outside of the space, but she's been quoted to have said things, you know, when asked about like where her identity is legible. Where is your Blackness in this work? And she would respond, or she had responded in moments being like, well, I'm also a woman, I'm also a daughter, I'm also like a teacher, I'm also so many other things in addition to this. Does the conversation have to always be reduced to this one thing in a particular way? So there's navigating that. And then she also has been, you know, has made statements about like trying to defend people to also see that, yes, it's abstraction, but my identity is still very present because everything that has impacted my life, everything I've seen, read, experienced, informs every decision I make in every painting. And that is part of that. My Blackness is a part of that too. So it's kind of like trying to straddle all of these lines and worlds of I guess, projections, right? About understanding of the work and how to contextualize it. And something to add to what Patrick said too, is that it's difficult for all of us because what tends to happen for everybody is that things need, what's the word? Not blurbs, but like taglines, right? Like people want to be able to kind of summarize so many things really quickly in like, you know, 8 to 10 words or whatever, 2 statements. And I think we're all invested in making complex images that are not just about like a singular narrative or not just about, they're also about engaging with the language of painting and the history of painting and our personal experience and, you know, all of these other things. And so it's complicated, but I think we're all just trying to approach it from these ways and be persistent about like complexity and like and reminding or like continuing to talk about the work and like from these many different angles. That's all you can do.
So well
It was
said.
something, yeah, very interesting about what you said with Thomas, and it's really interesting with I feel like abstraction sort of calls a demographic of people to the language, and you know what you said about Thomas is that, you know, I relate to that wholeheartedly, and I've actually sort of used that direct quote without having read it from her. So I think it's this really interesting shared experience that we have, which is probably one of the reasons why abstraction, you know, drew us to it.
And something else too is that abstract paintings and representational paintings are all abstractions, right? None of those are actually like facts of the matter. They're not photographs, they're not videos. They're all an act of interpretation. And one of the things that strikes me is there's a lot of things to the Black experience, to any experience for that matter, that is not said. A lot of things that are just felt as experiences that we internalize and hold on to. And I think abstraction has this great capacity to be able to tap into experiences that aren't always given a kind of verbal or linguistic dimension, but are just kind of like something that you internalized and felt and then carried along with you on your back with the rest of your memories. And that's not nothing. That's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of like psychic, psychological, and emotional energy, intellectual energy that's kind of just like sitting out there, festering, trying to find a home. And I think abstraction can really tap into that in a nice way.
Well, you know, thank you all for this wonderful conversation and for participating in the exhibition, What's It All About? And Amari, thank you for writing the exhibition essay, which is online at www.jenkinsjohnsongallery.com. I encourage everybody to read it. It's really insightful. And I just want to say, is there one last comment anybody might have before we close out?
I wanted to tell everybody thank you for making time to sit and think out loud about your work.
Thank you.
You
Thank
too.
you all. And politically, wear your mask and let's get through this. And we'll see you on the other side. And we'll see you at the Armory Show in September if you're going to be there. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.